All right, and we are live on the channel. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Alan has been excluded from the Writing Women in Fantasy panel. Next one, Alan, I'll make sure I invite you. So, hey friends, it's Tori. Welcome back to my channel. And this is another episode of Imposter Syndrome. This is the third episode already, which is crazy. Last month, we had three female authors come on and share their thoughts on writing women in fantasy. So you can definitely go check out episode 2 if you want to see the first half of this discussion. And this episode is dominated by the ladies of BookTube. I'm so excited to get to chat with all of you on this topic. So the first thing we're going to do is I will have you all introduce yourselves and your channels and let us know what you are currently reading. Kay, do you want to start us off?
Definitely. My name is Kayla, or Kay. My channel is Kay's Hidden Shelf, where I read a lot of fantasy, some sci-fi, and a sprinkling of other things. But then I talk about the books. I also do author interviews and just a smattering of a bunch of different videos. I am currently reading The Souls Aspect by Mark Holloway, which is a indie book. It is a fantasy, and the tagline that caught me was a healer turned killer.
Awesome. Johanna?
All right. Hello. My name is Johanna from the channel Johanna, and I mostly talk about fantasy on my channel. That's mostly what I read, but I do read other genres as well. And right now I'm actually reading multiple books at once. So I'm in a Shogun read along actually right now with Tori. So there's my Shogun up on my shelf. I'm reading a chapter a day right now. And I'm also very slowly reading Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses with Jimmy from the Fantasy Network. And we're also reading just a few pages of that a day. And I'm also reading, I just finished Knight of Knives by Ian C. Esselmont today. And I just started Clash of Kings and a Song of Ice and Fire read along that I'm hosting on my channel. So I'm very excited to be here. And thank you so much, Tori, for having me.
Absolutely. Varsha?
Hi, my channel is Reading by the Rainy Mountain. It's fairly new. I started it in August of last year, I think. And I've been not very diligent about posting content regularly on it yet, but I've got about like 8 videos so far. I recently, maybe about 3 years ago, discovered that fantasy and sci-fi is what I like reading best. And I still read pretty widely. I think the only genres I decidedly don't ever go near are mystery and thrillers or domestic thrillers. Those terrify me too much. But yeah, fantasy, sci-fi, and a smattering of like contemporary and literary fiction. What I'm reading right now, I am reading The Prestige by Christopher Priest. This is the book the movie is based on, if you have seen it. And I've been going through an endless cycle of, damn, I wish I hadn't seen the movie first. And oh no, but then I wouldn't have enjoyed the movie as much. But yeah, it's pretty brilliant so far. I'm also reading, well, I don't have the cover, but I'm reading the first book of the Sharing Knife series by, let's see, Lois McMaster Bujol. I think I'm saying that name correctly. Yeah, that's what I've got going on right now.
Nice. Andrew Meredith in the chat is a big fan of hers. He's trying to get me to read a book of hers this year, so I probably will jump on that. Anitha?
Hi, I'm Anitha. My channel name is Anitha Gade. I mostly read fantasy. Sometimes, if Alan has some read along, I will read historical fiction. I'm currently reading Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie, first law, and I'm also reading Shogun. I finished part 1 and I'm taking a break from that.
Nice. So before we get started, I do want to remind everybody, first of all, that down in the description box below, links to all of these ladies' channels are there. So you should pause what you're doing and go subscribe to them. And after that, the first question I want to do before we get into the really spicy topics of this, we're going to start just with a basic, how did you guys come into fantasy? Where was your beginning of when did you start reading the genre? How old were you? Like what kind of books started that journey for you? Should we go the opposite way? Anitha, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Frankly, I don't remember. I started reading in my first language. We used to have the short story collections every month. My grandfather used to bring those like 4 5 books every month from library. They have every kind of story, like contemporary fiction and also fantasy. I used to read everything, but I realized I used to enjoy fantasy, that magical world, imagining ourselves in that world. I used to enjoy them more. In English, I think it's Harry Potter,
Hmm,
because that's very accessible to me. I did try Lord of the Rings, but I could not understand anything. I used to open dictionary for every word, but Harry Potter was very accessible to me.
nice. Varsha?
Oh, I think the first fantasy book I ever read was probably The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton. That I read back in fourth grade or something. And then I guess Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, when, well, a little after college. But I read these books that were popular alongside everything else that I just wanted to read. I didn't realize that the fantasy genre and sci-fi are what I primarily like until I watched this video that Daniel Green and Murphy Napier put out, ranking a bunch of fantasy series from like beginner to advanced. And most of the series they mentioned were series I had read and really enjoyed, or series that I planned to read soon. I was like, that's what I like reading. So that happened 2 years ago. So that's how I came into the fantasy genre, but I like read a lot before then.
All
Nice.
right, nice. Yeah, so for me, I found out about fantasy books. I got introduced to it through J.R.R. Tolkien, nothing original there. So I started out with The Hobbit, and then I went into Lord of the Rings. I actually didn't finish Lord of the Rings when I was a teenager. I got all the way to The Return of the King and stopped reading for a while. I just went through a reading slump for some reason. But other fantasy I got into as a teen included some of the Elric saga and some Piers Anthony and David Eddings and um, things like The Neverending Story, the book, The Princess Bride, the book. I also love the movies of those, and The Last Unicorn book and movie too. So I think a lot of book to movie adaptations spoke to me when I was younger. But yeah, I think that would be the start of my journey anyway.
Yeah, for myself, I actually struggled with reading when I was a kid. So the earliest one I can remember was probably the Harry Potter series. But my mom was big into fantasy, sci-fi, so we had a lot of that stuff in the home, whether it was movies, shows, or books. After that, it'd probably be later in my teens. One author that came to mind was Trudy Canavan with
Mm.
the Mage series, and that was great. So it's probably that's as far back as my memory goes. Breakfast is a blur, so
That's fair. Yeah, I think Narnia was probably one of my earliest fantasy, the things that I remember of fantasy, and shortly after that I got into some of the Japanese animes that had a lot of fantasy elements in them. And yeah, I don't think I can go back any farther than Narnia, like the old BBC, like the horrible CGI, and the White Witch was so much scarier in the original ones, probably because I was a lot smaller. But yeah, and I think it's cool because I love being surrounded by people who have such different entrance points to fantasy at different ages in different series, and that's something that I think really adds to the different perspectives that we're going to get on the topic, which I'm very excited about. So, without any further ado, let's go into a character, a female fantasy character that you really love or loved from nostalgia's sake, and why it is that that character really spoke to you. I'm asking the really hard questions first.
hmm.
Do you want to start with anybody in particular and go around, or
You guys don't everybody talk at once, but
well, I can go
Varsha,
ahead and start
go
here.
for it,
That's
Johanna.
all right. So I actually just talked about this a little bit on my channel because And by the way, I actually did get into Narnia when I was a kid, and I always forget about that. I watched the BBC productions as well, and I went to Catholic school in elementary, and my third grade teacher read our class some of the Narnia books, but I always forget about that. So that's cool that you brought that back up. But no, like for me, what's interesting about this is that I already knew, especially with The Hobbit. As soon as I read The Hobbit and the beginning of Lord of the Rings, I fell in love with fantasy. Immediately, I knew this was going to be my genre. And what's interesting about it is that I went through many reading slumps, even with fantasy and with books in general, with reading fiction in general. And then it wasn't until I discovered A Song of Ice and Fire when I was much older at the time. So, but this was about like 11, 12 years ago now. And when I discovered that series, I fell in love with Martin's writing. I fell in love with that world. But what spoke to me was the female characters. Like, I could not believe how I was reading a series of female characters because that weren't idealized. Because in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, you have Galadriel and you have Arwen and you have certain female characters, but I feel like most of them are fairly idealized. I mean, there's some, I mean, Eowyn's a good character, but in general, I didn't feel like I related to them. And then when I read A Song of Ice and Fire, I'm like, these are female characters who are flawed, who are three-dimensional, who are interesting in that way. And so for me, it took a long time before I found female characters that I felt like I could relate to and attach to, especially in adult fantasy.
Yeah, for myself, I would have to say it's probably more of a recent read in the last few years, which would be the Winter Night trilogy by Catherine Arden. I just love how the female characters are presented in a way that is relatable to history and put into a fantasy setting. And not only do they have to handle the societal norms and pressures and struggles, they also have to deal with the fantastical elements and the choices that were made for those, like what the characters go through, their arcs, really spoke to me in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
That's a
No,
great trilogy. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's good that you mentioned Winter Night Trilogy. I would have, if you know.
Okay.
Um, I know no one is talking about J.K. Rowling now, but what she created in Harry Potter, that emotion, that feeling won't change for me. Every female character in that, Hermione or McGonagall or even Mrs. Weasley, everyone, they impacted me so much because at that time, when I read them when I was growing up in India, all movies and TVs, women characters are not good. So I needed that actually. I felt so good reading about them, so I could not ignore them. I mean, I have to mention them. And there are many others, like I love Butler's female characters, Lauren from Parable of the Sever, and I love Tenar from Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin, and female characters from Long Price Quartet. I can talk about them for hours. Oh my god, it's like it's for everyone how to write female characters in a misogynistic world. Please read Long Price Quartet.
That's on my fairly immediate-ish TBR here in the next few months, so I'm very excited to get to that.
That leaves me.
It does.
I think Tenar for me was a very big favorite. I think yes, there's about 3 Earthsea books that she plays a big part in, and I love her so much. I think the Tehanu is my favorite, and she's such a strong person who is in such control of her life, who knows what she wants and like does everything she can to go get it. I love her character. But I also want to mention Esun. From The
Broken
Broken
Earth.
Earth. Yes, thank you. The Broken Earth. I love her for the same reasons. I think both these women, they take care of their family, and mostly I think a lot of sensitivity is what they center their actions around, and I love those characters for that.
Yeah. Katie brought up one of my favorites. So as a tomboy, I mentioned this in the last one too. Oftentimes in fantasy, I was seeing very beautiful, very feminine women, and that was really awesome. But I never really found a character that I was like, oh my gosh, they're like this. I feel this in my soul, kind of thing. Until I got to A Song of Ice and Fire, and I met Brienne of Tarth, and I was like, that totally blew my mind, because that was one of the first times I'd seen a character in fantasy that was, you know what, she's a knight, and her father was like, you know, you're going to be a knight because I don't know what else to make of you. You know, and just her whole story and all of the things that she, like how big a part of the story she was. And now I'm appreciating, as a mom looking back, I'm appreciating, you know, Catelyn Stark a whole lot more than I did when I first read the series. And I think Malazan was also one that was a big surprise for me, because I really appreciated the variety of female characters in there as well. So yeah, there's some really, really good ones. And I have the opinion that that's just going to keep expanding now that we're and that's a topic that I think I want to touch on next, because how do you guys feel like fantasy and the portrayal of female characters has changed, um, you know, going from past experience to now? What are you seeing, what changes are you seeing within that portrayal? Varsha, I know you have a video on your channel about where you went into, and I can't remember if it's a fairy tale specifically, but it's the one where it's the woman that lives on the mountain and she has to take care of the boy. And then you also review some of the Malazan books on your channel. So like, is there a how do those two things compare, and what's the differences there, if you saw any?
Sure. So I don't know that I can speak for change or evolution over time, because I just recently started really intensely reading into the genre. So I'm like picking and choosing pretty randomly. But the different types of characters that I've seen, I think for Malazan, I wouldn't necessarily be able to pick a favorite character or one favorite female character. But what stood out for me really prominently was in the first book. Lon is, I think, probably the highest commanding officer of the army, right? And I waited for someone to say something throughout the whole book about how a woman is in power, and I had just come off of the Wheel of Time, where everyone makes a comment about something a woman is doing or something a man is doing, honestly, for that matter. But so I waited for someone to say something, and I think by the time I realized that nothing was going to be mentioned, that this is just part of this world, that sort of blew my mind. So I think everything I had read, fantasy or not, did make it a point to state that a woman is in power whenever that happened. So that's why I really appreciate the female characters in Malazan. And then I think, yeah, there's characters like the two that I mentioned earlier, Esun and Tenar, and also I forget the name, Sybil, I think, from The Forgotten Beasts of Eld by Patricia McKillip. That's the book you mentioned, Tori. Yeah, those people take actions driven by their family and driven by the need to protect. And yeah, there's not a lot of selfish motivation. In the case of Sybil, I think there is some because she was harmed and she wants vengeance. But mostly like these characters, I think these are the ones that I probably tend to like the most. And then there's the third kind. I spent a lot of time reading YA last year, which features a lot of female characters who have this sort of, I think a lot of the ones I read happen to be chosen one tropes. Like I read The Ember Quartet, I read Blood Marked, and they have this like sort of self affirmation about like I did this and I am so strong and so powerful, even if some of the things just happened to them and they didn't make things happen. That I get borderline irritated about. But I think that can be done well. I just didn't like it in the books that I had read. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know that I can give a whole lot of comparison either, just because I haven't read a whole lot of classic fantasy. From what I have read, the biggest difference that I can note offhand is the description of physique.
Mm.
That is one that always irritated me. Um, but and roles, what a woman's role was, housekeeper, maid, nurse.
Mm-hmm.
It was kind of reserved to the side crew while the big burly characters went off and had an adventure and did their thing, completed a quest or whatever it was. Um, there's also in more modern fantasy that we're seeing, there's a big distinction between strong female characters. You have the strong female characters who are still kind of in the background. They have these positions of power, but more in a political sense. And then you have these all out, beefed up, powerful women who are in the blood and grit of these battles as well. Um, with that wide distinction, I really appreciate it because we still get a taste of a woman who might be at home, but we get more depth to her. We get more insight into how she's, having all of these uh, interactions and influences behind the scenes of the bigger plots. But then we also get some characters who are just fantastic with action and not afraid to mix the two with depth and that strength physically.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not, some of those are realistic, that's where fantasy comes in, right? They might be beefed up with some fantastical powers, but I just appreciate the wide variety of strong female characters that you can get now, as opposed to physique side girl back home that, is waiting on, I hope he comes back, from his
Yeah.
quest. But yeah, like the damsel in distress kind of
Yeah.
thing. Um, I just appreciate the diversity and the depth that we get now.
Yeah. Well, and Patricia is saying too, it's really remarkable progress to have a book with a woman in power that is not then shoved in your face. There's more to men and women than what they do. And I think that kind of speaks to, that idea that what is, even regardless of the character's gender, what is a strong character? What does that mean? How do we define that? And I think for a lot of people that means, well, it's the one that's got the two swords and they're out and they're the strong and they're very obviously in power, or those things. And I think we're getting a very broad spectrum now of, sometimes it is the farm wife who has to defend her children and her homestead while her husband is off at war, and where's that story, that kind of stuff. And there's so many different parts of that that can be explored, which is exciting as a writer, because it just means like there's so many different possibilities of how we can portray these characters.
Yeah, I know I said this, I've been saying this a lot recently, so I'm sorry if it's like a little bit of a broken record at this point for me to say this, but I know I watched Steven Erikson say this actually a couple of times in a couple of panels about how when he's writing when he thinks about writing characters, he thinks about characters having some level of contradiction about themselves, because none of us are 100% consistent 100% of the time. We have conflicting influences in our lives. We're not going to be the sweet girl all the time. We're not going to be the mean girl all the time. We're not going to be the strong one all the time or the weak one all the time. We're always there. There could be multiple aspects of a person, and that's true of male and female characters. Yeah, it's interesting. And Bookborn, by the way, did a really good video about female characters at one point. I don't know if you all watched that, but she was talking about something I had never heard of before, but it made so much sense. I can't remember what it's called, so you all can refresh my memory on this, but it's something about some kind of test where if the female character has a scene where she's not talking about like the love interest, where she's not talking about the male, where she has some other layers to her. I mean, I think it's fine to have a romantic interest or for the female character to have a sexual attraction or whatever. I'm all for that. But I think that having other layers too, having other dimensions to the person too, where they're thinking about other matters, they have other concerns, they have other aspirations, to have that. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's the test. that is, I think that's actually a pretty good indicator of how much work goes in a character. And I say that's a good indicator. I mean, I feel like that's baseline, but a lot of classic fantasy probably didn't do that. I'm going to imagine. Maybe I'm over speaking about classic fantasy. I'm sure you'll find some examples somewhere, but I think that you do probably historically see a lot of people tests fail as far
Yeah.
as that's concerned.
Yeah. ANITHA?
Mm, Even I can talk about how women characters work then, because I did not read most of the classic fantasy, but I can talk about how my perspective changed. Because when I began, I wanted them to be fighters, I wanted them to be warriors, because we have a couple of history figures we read about, where one of these queens, we were colonized. So when Britishers came, when her husband died, one of the queens went to fight. So she used to be our inspiration. So initially, as a kid, even as a teenager, I wanted to be like that. But now I wanted, as you said, whoever it is, when the problem comes, when they have their own agency, when they can solve their own problems, those characters I am more appreciating now. Tenar is a good example. She is introduced to us first, as a priestess who has some magical powers, like 15-16-year-old girl, but in later books we see her as a middle-aged widow. She chose to let go of her whole life and she got to settle down, got married and all. But when we meet her in the later book, she's a widow, and she finds this, how to talk without spoilers. She she finds this child who is going through trauma. She starts raising her, and we see her kindness, we see her pain by looking at this child, how this child is handling the trauma, how to create safe life for her, how to make her trust her. That's such a well done book, Tenor. Well done character. And I want to take this opportunity to talk about one character from Shadow Campaigns by Django Wexler. He created a female character, Winter. she she's part of the army. She is disguised as a man, but even then he did not portray her as a man. We see her as a vulnerable character. We see all her feelings, all her emotions. Just because she's strong, he did not kill her as a human. He retained that in that character. I really like that part.
Yeah. And I think too, I mean, there's so much that can be said here about characterization in general, and all these characters and what we want when we read these books, and how we are so magnetized to those characters who have that depth, and all of those. It's not just a single layer. There's things that you keep discovering about them as you go on through the story, which is something I always love, when you don't just have you meet this character at the beginning of the book and that's who they are through the entire thing, and it's a very static experience with them. Then they just kind of fade into the background and you don't really get to have that arc with that character. But yeah, I haven't read a lot of classic fantasy either, and part of the reason for that is because of what we're talking about. I'm going to be very picky about what classic fantasy I read, and I'm going to be relying very heavily on the taste of my friends who can say, "Yep, this is a good one." um, because yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't think that's. I think the female characters are a big part of that, but I think it's just in general that the characterization in general has changed a lot. We're a lot more internal with our characters now, which is something I really appreciate. Um, so yeah, I really like what you said, Anitha, about having, when we come into a fantasy, and having what we want out of a character, and how that can change. Because I know in my reading experience that has also changed, where I expected a lot of things out of characters at the beginning, and now I'm starting to expand into what I'm willing to be intrigued by, I guess. Um, yeah, Andrew is convinced that he's gonna. I'm planning on reading Curse of Shalion this year. So if anybody wants to buddy read with that,
Yes,
read that
yes,
with me
yes.
later. Let's do
You
it.
know, when I finished Deathless Beast, that's the first thing Andrew recommended to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Alan also said Lady Sybil Ramkin from the Discworld
Yeah.
Watch books is a paragon of strength through her compassion for the weak and abandoned without ever picking up a weapon. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. She has a lot of compassion for these sickly little dragons. It's so
Oh.
cute. And
Granny
Tori, I
Weatherwax is
know-
another Discworld. Sorry, go ahead.
Which one?
Granny Weatherwax is another Discworld character I love.
Ah,
Mm,
I
yeah.
haven't read that one yet, but um, Tori, I still think Guns of the Dawn. I think you're
I
gonna
have it.
love it.
I have it right there.
Every time I talk to you, I'm like, oh, she's gonna love Emily Marshwick. I could be wrong. I hope I'm not wrong, but I have a feeling you might like her. And what comes
She
to my
will.
mind when I think about Emily Marshwick is the fact that she. I like the fact that we see a side of her with her family, and then we see a different side of her in the military. And we also see some really fantastic subversions of familiar tropes that are done in a gendered way. So I don't know. I have a feeling it will land with you. I have a feeling you'll like it.
I'm really excited to read that because both you and Alan have very strongly recommended that one to me for the same reason. So I'm really looking forward to it. And kind of when you guys were talking, and it kind of came up with Lady Sybil too. I think, and I'd love to get you guys' opinions on this. Celebrating things like compassion that are very, I would say. That's a very feminine kind of concept, that there's that compassion, but celebrating it as a strength instead of a weakness is maybe a difference between some of the comparisons that we see in the portrayals in different fantasy books. Do you feel like different strengths that women have, if they were portrayed as strengths, that they would be like more palatable to us as readers, instead of, oh, she's compassionate, therefore it's a weakness?
I guess I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, just like if we have a character in a fantasy novel and that she's portrayed as very compassionate, the tone of how that is portrayed, I'm trying to be much more articulate because that was a horrible rambly question, I apologize.
Oh, you're fine.
Do you think that the portrayal of that compassion changes how we appreciate the character, whether it's portrayed as a weakness or a strength?
Yes,
Interesting.
yes,
Yeah.
actually, because sorry, Johanna, I just got a thought and I just started talking. You know, initially, even in how to say classic books, very few of the books I read, even when women show compassion or even men show compassion, other characters um, look down on them, saying you're acting like a woman, you're acting weak. So it showed as weakness. But when others convert that to a theme, that's when it changes to strength. Like as I said in Legwin's Tehanu, also. Okay, it's very difficult to talk without spoilers, you know.
Booktube in a nutshell.
Yeah.
I would,
I know.
go ahead. Sorry.
I wanted to mention Butler's Earthseed series, but I'm thinking to talk where I mean around spoilers. It's a dystopian setting where they live in these inside walls, against attacks by against rights. So they have to, some of these people get together and they have to um, form a society, their own society. there actually compassion and this teamwork plays a big role for their survival. I think when authors take that as a theme for their big theme for their book, it plays a major role in moving that story. I think that's all.
Yeah.
Interesting. I would say that it depends on how the author portrays compassion, because I don't think compassion in real life is an easy quality.
Mm-mm.
If they're portraying it as like, oh, it's just something that comes naturally to somebody, I don't know that that's the case. I guess maybe some of that bias comes from reading Malazan too, because that being such a huge theme in that series, not the only theme as we talked about the other night, but as one as one of the major ones. It really does. I think it really came to my mind like how difficult it is and how much it requires a sense of empathy and understanding that's not always easy, especially when you can perceive somebody as being other than yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I for myself, I'd have to say that showing emotional reactions is tricky, especially in a female character because, oh, you're being crazy, like, you're overreacting. Why are you so happy, or why are you so upset over something so small? Whereas in a lot of fantasy that I've read with female characters, there's silence over injustices, over even the smallest thing where they're treated poorly, let's say, by a partner or another person in the story, and their silence is considered strength. Yes, to a degree, but I also think that when they have the ability to be vulnerable enough to share their emotions and the author be able to portray that in a way where that's considered a strength, I would love to see that more, because too often do I see a female character where she has to bide everything in silence. And when she has an emotional reaction to something, you are being a hysterical woman, sit down. you know?
Mm.
It's the hormones.
Yeah, it's oh, she's pregnant, get her down, get her it's just, you know?
Wow.
So, it's, that's something I would love to see more portrayal of, is that there's strength in communicating your emotions and you're not hysterical, or the character's not hysterical.
Well
Yeah.
said. Well
I
said.
think
Yeah.
I think that's the one of the reasons why authors are forced to write strong female characters lacking compassion, lacking empathy, being indifferent to others. I think that's what forced them. I think I'm very happy that it's being changed now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of what matters to me is trying to figure out whether it's a character's opinion, whatever is being said that I'm disagreeing with or not liking reading, or the author's opinion. And I think I was not able to really distinguish that until recently. And I honestly don't know if I still can. But when I can say, for instance, I think in A Game of Thrones, the opening page has a character saying something about how you should never trust anything you learn at a woman's knees or something like that. It was all I could do to keep reading at that point. But then, there are characters later on who are strong female characters whom I liked. But yeah, so I think being able to figure out whether it's a character's perspective or the author's perspective is important. And sometimes I feel like maybe I read something as the author's intention and like I can't read this book. Yeah. But yes, to your point about whether the portrayal of how compassion is represented and what the tone is when talking about it, I think, yeah, there's a lot of factors that play into it. But if it's clear to me that it's the author's opinion, that's when it bothers me. Yeah, if it's a character, you're just writing a character, they can have opinions that are different. So
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's actually a very important thing, by the way. Like if if what the perspective is coming from the character's perspective or versus the author. Yeah, that's such a good point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember reading last year a book where there was a point where it was very obvious when the author came through and the characters were just kind of puppeting around while the author told us things that they wanted us to know. And that is another one that pulls me out right away, because then you're taking away your character's agency and taking away their story. And no offense, but I want to know what they're what they're doing, especially if you're into a series and you've been with these characters for a certain amount of time. Charmaine said Ken Liu in Dandelion Dynasty gives us so many diverse and empowering portrayals of women and girlhood. I was blown away, and he raised my standards for female characters written by male authors. Yeah, I'm excited to read that one. That's one that I'm hoping to get to soon, because I've heard a lot of really good things about that.
Yeah, you just shot that up my TBR, Charmaine.
Right?
Read LPQ first, both of you.
Yes, ma'am. I'm excited to read both of those. The problem is there's not enough time in the day for all of the books that I want to read, as you guys can probably relate to. Yeah, I agree with this too, Trisha. I think that one of the tropes is seeing vulnerability and compassion and emotion as a female trait, and strength and power as male. All those qualities are found in both genders equally. Yeah, I would agree with that. And that goes back to the depth that we were talking about with the characters, that we're not all just a single note.
Right. What do you all think about, so I feel like I've heard, one thing I appreciate is the portrayal of trauma in fantasy. And I feel like this is covered in female characters quite a bit, especially characters, because there's always a lot of like sexual violence in adult fantasy, especially some in even young adult fantasy. What do you all think about that, especially regarding female characters?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. My big pet peeve is leave the pregnant women alone in fantasy. Please, every time there's a pregnant woman, something happens, and it's always traumatic. At this point, it just feels like a standard. Yeah, I'd definitely say trauma has a big impact in so many ways, and I feel like it could go down into a layered topic, because you get so many different sides of, okay, there's the trauma shutdown. The character shuts down and we never hear how they handled it. And then there's the other side of, you get every detail of how they handled it. I've seen characters in fantasy where they go through trauma, they kind of flatline with their character growth and arc. They get a little peak and then it goes right back to where they were at. And all that growth that they had was just taken away in a very unsatisfying way. I don't know if I probably went off tangent there, but it's trauma is tricky, I think, because everyone experiences trauma differently, and you are writing your own character and their own experience of it. And I think some authors do a phenomenal job at exploring the character depth and growth that can come from it. And others dip their toes in and it feels like they get scared and they're like, "Whoa, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to, make anyone uncomfortable." So it happened kind of in the sidelines and it didn't impact the character at all. And for me, as a character-driven reader, I want to see how they go through it. That's part of the story to me. How do they handle the emotions after the fact? How do they handle the people around them after the fact? That's something I'd love to continue to see more of. And I would hope authors are, when they dip their toes in, stay brave, just keep going.
Varsha, you were nodding along to that. Do you want to add to that?
Oh, I was agreeing about, I don't think I've read a lot of books where violence against women feels, or just violence in general feels gratuitous. There was a couple, though, that really bugged me because something happens to a woman and then it's as if nothing happened. It's just there to suddenly shock you for whatever. And then everyone moves on, almost like it never happened. And I'm like, what was the point of subjecting me to that scene earlier? So yes, that kind of thing definitely does bother me. But yeah, if the purpose is to explore themes of trauma and it's going somewhere, like I think a lot of Malazan characters are really done well in that respect, then yes, I can see the point in that. But yeah, and I think honestly, you can do that with male or female characters. I think maybe female characters are subjected to it more often without the follow up exploration of what it did to them. It's just there as a plot device. That bugs me. Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm just seeing in the chat, Andrew and Alan, I've already brought up Emily Marshwick. But yes, Tori needs to read Guns of the Dawn.
I definitely will be, I promise.
So just
And
to
Kayla too. I
plug
think
that
Kayla would
in.
love it too. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, Evie and I are buddy reading it, I think, in March with one other person. So join us.
I'll be reading it in March probably then.
There we go.
I agree with both Kay and Varsha. Trauma can be very personal. We don't know what triggers who. So the reaction can be very, what's the word? What's the word? Anyway, that depends totally on their, personal experiences. Uh, I read a trilogy where one person has gone through. I mean, we see that actually that person going through that on paper. It's not like a implied. We see that step by step, and for me, I mean, many people said that they got a satisfying ending, but I did not feel like that. I did not think it was handled well, because everyone, including her family members, including her friends, did not believe her. When I said that, other people said that's what happens in the world. I mean, just because it's common, it doesn't mean that I should be okay with that. uh, it it just, I understand why other execute it that way. It does happen in real life, where people won't believe that that really happened to the person. But I, just because it is common, I somehow I am still not okay with that. Leaving like that, even after that healing part, that resolving trauma part, it wasn't done well. So when we are going through that, when character is going through the traumatic experience, as Kay said, if you are dipping into that, please, you know I respect it more when that was closed properly, when we get that closure by the end of the book, when we heal along with that character. If the character, after reading 200 pages of that traumatic experience, if the character is healed within a minute, we don't get that closure. We won't get healed. That's very important for me.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes back to Varsha's point about gratuitous, like, is it there for the shock value, which is something that immediately makes me very upset at a book if I'm reading it and I can tell this happened 5 pages later. Did it happen? Are you sure? And I mean, if the author is doing that intentionally, because one of the ways that people can respond to trauma is suppression, right? So like that makes sense. But if I think it's fairly easy to tell when an author is doing that intentionally versus just this happened and shock value and now we're on to the next plot point, which immediately, like you said, cheapens the characters and makes us disbelieve, well, okay, what was the point of that?
Just to tack on to that quickly, one specific thing, and I think it's another good example that goes with this, is PTSD. I can count so many male characters that go through PTSD. I don't think I can count a single one that I've read that's female who struggles with PTSD after the trauma. And
They are
for
just
me,
overreacting.
yeah, they're stoic, they're silent, they bear it, or they're like magic, healed, fine. So I think that's another point that come on, give us some balance there.
Yeah, I think that
I think
ties
one of
in.
the
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Joanna.
no, you go ahead.
I think that ties into the need to present strong female characters. And I think a side effect, apparently, of strong female characters that they don't feel. So, no, I cannot allow myself to feel anything for what just happened to me, right? So, yeah, I think in the extreme where they become warriors and out to kill people, they don't mind that they are killing. Or if anything bad happens to them, they can't allow themselves to feel bad about it. So yeah, I think the need for strong female characters rules out sometimes the need to allow them to feel anything. Sorry, go ahead, Joanna.
No, beautifully said. Beautifully said. Yeah, I was just thinking about how, without giving away spoilers, one of my favorite portrayals of trauma. I feel like trauma is portrayed multiple times in Malazan Book of the Fallen, both for male and female characters, actually. And it's interesting because in the male characters, sometimes that just comes up in odd memories, and it's like the way of processing. But there's one particular portrayal of female trauma. I mean, there are a couple of really amazing examples, but there's one that happens in book 5 specifically that I'm thinking about. And one thing that I really appreciated about this particular female character is that even though the trauma definitely affected who she was after the fact, like you saw the long repercussions of it, you still had a lot of character work building up before the trauma. So I like that it wasn't just the trauma defining her. It was like there was a person, there was actually a well fleshed out individual before this thing happened. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people don't think about too, because a lot of times we do have these shock moments in fantasy. And I'm not saying they shouldn't be there, honestly, but I do think sometimes that can be the only, if that's the only thing that defines a person. I think that's cutting the person off a little bit short, because there were qualities obviously prior to trauma. And maybe even aside from just trauma, there's other qualities there too, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when you have a traumatic event that involves multiple people, one of the easy ways that, not easy in a sense, ways that you can explore that is showing how different people respond to the same event or the same, trauma. Because that's something that I try to do whenever I can in my writing, because I want to show, look, the same thing can happen and 2 people were involved in it, or 3 people, or a whole bunch of people, and it's showing up in very different ways depending on who they are as a person coming into that experience. So I think that's a way that often authors can have a chance to show, this isn't just a one note thing. There's characters who are treating this. One of them pretends it never happened because it's that suppression thing. The other one is like kind of stuck in that PTSD wheel of the, can't really get out of the flashbacks or whatever it is. So there's so many different ways to portray that too, that I think sometimes we limit ourselves to say this is how we show this thing, and really not taking the time to dive in and figure out what different angles in what different ways could I look at this.
Yeah, well said.
Patricia says, trying to find that balance with trauma is so difficult. I appreciate those in my life willing to speak to me about their own trauma to help me write realistic characters. I want those experiencing or who have experienced trauma to find light and encouragement in my books. Yeah. And I think that's often a tough balance, because showing the trauma and all of the difficult struggles that come along with that, and yet still balancing that with, where do you find the light? How do you, and one of the things I really appreciate about Malazan is that I mentioned in a video that I did last year, was that sometimes I think we expect too much of those characters too quickly, and that we almost have this, I called it the trauma to TED Talk syndrome, where we have this trauma and we kind of want to skip all the middle stuff because that's kind of like, boring, or there's the 1 step forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. And we just want to hear the TED Talk at the end of it. And that's something that I have noticed with how people, when they approach characters with trauma, that's kind of what they seem to be looking for. And that I think that's something that needs to be challenged more in the writing that we do.
Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
That was a brilliant talk on your brilliant
Thank you,
discussion on your
Johanna.
channel. Yeah.
AR has a question actually.
Yeah,
If
I was just
anyone
about
else
to pull that up. Thanks, Anitha. What's the number one thing you see in the way fantasy women are written that makes you want to stop reading? Anitha, do you want to answer that one first?
uh, okay. First, I'll twist the question. If there is profanity against women, especially suppose, for example, in some books, that use of word "or" for everything, for world building or for plot, for characters, if that word is used, I want to DNF actually very fast. I cannot. Recently, I read a book. Sorry, I mean, it's very bad to give specific examples, but I want you to understand. So they go to this town. There, some bad smell is there. So that's defined as it is smelling like unwashed ore. You know, so that's not needed there, but though those when that word is repeated like some 10 times in couple of pages, I can deal with it. It's too much for me.
Mm-hmm.
And to the way fantasy woman, you guys go ahead, I need to think about this exact answer.
No worries. Varsha?
Um, I think maybe again it comes down to character versus author point of view. But let's say it is the author and it's being done for several characters, all male characters. Think about the female characters this way. Um, I think too much description of physical appearances. I think in theory, I guess Wheel of Time qualifies, but it's women thinking about women. That doesn't bother me. Men thinking about women in objectification, is that the right word? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like I missed a syllable there, but yes, objectification of women, that bothers me. And I guess actually that bothers me a little bit less than if women are treated as being incompetent in some sense. I think an example I have, this might be a bad example, but the first book in the Foundation trilogy, I know the question is about fantasy, but the first book in the Foundation trilogy, there was an advertisement or something about some brand new robotic knife. And the advertisement was that women will really love this. And I got really mad. Like, you saw us hundreds of thousands of years in the future, but you didn't see women out of the kitchen. So that bugged me quite a bit. But I think maybe I need to read that and figure out author versus character perspectives there again. But yes, that did bug me enough to not pick up another Foundation book after that.
Yeah. I think that Varsha basically nailed it for me. It's like if it's the author versus the character,
Yep.
if you feel like the author's voice is coming through as having a misogynistic perspective, then that's just a big no for me. Um, I have a controversial kind of take here in that I know this is going to sound bad, and I promise you I'm a feminist, but I actually, and I'm going to probably sound like I'm not a feminist in saying this, but I actually don't have a huge problem with the male gaze in fantasy books. But again, I think that also comes down to a bit with the character perspective because I think, and it could vary, you know what I mean? So, but I do think that sexuality is a part of life and being able to be attracted to the opposite sex via physical attraction is a part of life. And so I guess I just don't really have a big problem with that in a book. I'm sure there are ways it could be done that'll make me cringe, but I've just noticed that I don't think that stuff really bothers me as much as it does, even for some male readers that I know. So just wanted to share that.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine is probably very specific, but I will DNF a book if the female character, their entire identity is wrapped around love interest. I cannot stand the identity of a character being lost to a relationship, a love interest in specific. you can get some really interesting storylines out of that if you have a really intricate character arc planned. But, like an example here would be The Wolf of Oren-Yaro. This is a trilogy, and the entire book, this character is lost in that blindness of love, and I don't want to continue because I'm like, do I want to read another 1,200 pages to find out how this character arc works out? So it's don't lose the integrity of your character entirely to just infatuation or love, whatever it is. Give them a bit more depth, bit more, experience beyond just the infatuation and puppy eyes.
Yeah, and I think Johanna kind of hit on my point a little bit too, where for me, I'm also not really bothered by the idea of male gaze in books or that kind of stuff. I think for me, it's, is this a character who is like more that way, again, like Johanna said, or is this the author where like every woman in the entire book is viewed in a certain lens from all of the, you know what I mean, like if it's just prevalent everywhere, as opposed to this character tends to be a little bit more like he ogles a little bit more, or whatever, she ogles a little bit more, whoever it is, like if it's that something about that character's personality, and it's very, and there's again a variety or a spectrum of how the characters all view each other, I am totally willing to buy into that. It's more when it's just every character is viewed in the same lens, and then you can really tell that it's coming from the author and not the characters.
Yeah.
So, actually, you all covered very good points that all bother me. For me, when female characters, violence against female characters are used to develop male characters, there is no agency given to female characters. I cannot, I went through all my Goodreads read list, but I cannot find any book. But I thought of a movie, Indian movie. There was this movie. This guy was blind. He gets married, and his wife was raped, and there is no story to her character. She commits suicide and she died. But the story is about him, actually. His pain, how he takes revenge irrespective of being blind. That actually, I mean, they used that violence against women to develop his character, to show how great he is. That bothers me a lot.
Mhm.
I'm gonna make sure that I haven't missed any other.
Are you talking, Anitha, are you talking about the fridging trope? I'm not like, so the fridging trope would be, I'm trying to see if I understand what you're talking about. Is that like when the fridging trope, from what I understand, is when something happens to a female character and then that spurs the male character to act? And that kind
See,
of robs the female character from doing anything, from agency, which is why it's called fridging.
okay. I see. I don't have any problem with that. Guy has the reaction. Of course, he also deals with that trauma. He also has pain. He also has grief. I totally understand that. But denying that grief and pain for that female character, giving some kind of agency to that character, completely nullifying and completely focusing on this male character's grief, I somehow, I'm not comfortable with that. If you want to focus on the only male character, create some problem to him. I mean, it may be weird, but that's how I feel.
No, I understand. Okay,
Yeah,
thanks for
totally.
explaining that.
And there, I mean, to be honest, I feel like that's just something where, again, we talked about how all of us have different things that bother us for different reasons to DNF a book, different reasons to dislike a character. And that's not, I don't think there's anything weird about that, Anitha. It's just, that's one of your lines, and that's totally valid. Hi, Sarah. 11th cycle I know has been getting a lot of buzz for a lot of that, Andrew. So I will probably read it at some point, and I will get back to you on that. But it seems like with this conversation we're having, it seems like PTSD in general and mental illnesses have become much more prevalent in a lot of the just fantasy, but also in books in general. Do you think that that it's almost I think that's kind of what I'm trying to say is I think that kind of going back to the shock value idea that we mentioned earlier and how I think sometimes authors jump into that kind of as a bandwagon as opposed to really understanding what it is they are portraying. And we probably spoke to that a little bit already, but I was curious to know if anybody had any further thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think not. I went through a phase when I read a lot of romance books. So yeah, in romance, when you have a deep, dark, brooding character, they usually have had a lot of trauma or whatever, and yeah, that usually feels like it's just there so they can get together and whatnot. So yeah, if it feels like the trope is being used somehow, and I think different people will have different perspectives on what their definition of used is, but yeah, if it feels used, then yeah, I can't get behind it. But if the author is trying to do something meaningful with that by putting their characters through whatever, because when we are reading something, we are also to a certain extent experiencing, like, not obviously to the same level, but we are subjecting ourselves to some negativity. So that has to have meaning for me. I can't just read it for the sake of it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah, there's a lot of chat in the comments about conveying the multifaceted nature of mental illness as it pertains to different characters and different situations. Sarah says, for me, I don't like retellings where a male character is changed into a woman. It's too on the nose, and why not just do something new instead of a retelling? So like a gender bender kind of retelling. Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of what we were all saying too, is that yeah, the attraction part is just a character, it shouldn't be the only trait that we're
Thank you,
concerned about.
Andrew. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going into that a little bit, one of the questions I wrote down that I hadn't sent you guys in the email was I'm very intrigued right now because I am writing a variety of female characters in my work in progress currently. I'm really curious to chat a tiny bit about female villains and how female villains are portrayed, because that's something that just fascinates me and I love a good female villain. So I would love to just kind of open that up. I don't have a specific direction to take that, but I would love to know you guys' thoughts on female villains. Anitha was already clapping.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to say this from the beginning, but one character I wanted to mention is a big spoiler. I can't even mention what series it is about, but it'll be a big spoiler if I mention that character name. So I'll mention my second favorite. Yeah, as Chairman said, I love a good female antagonist. My second favorite is from Greenbone Saga, Aikmada. She was done very well for 2.5 books. Ending, I am like pretty very okay, but until then, she was strong, powerful, and she instantly attracted me actually. That I mean, she being a woman in that, I mean, I'm not saying anything against being a woman, but in that misogynistic world, um, winning over, getting to that power, what is that, Charmaine, help me here, what is that leader term in Greenhorn Saga?
don't know.
Call.
I've only read
Okay.
the first book, so I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Becoming the head of that group, that gang. What Mada did and what Fonda Lee did with her, I really, really liked her in Green Moon Saga. Every time I talk about, Green Moon Saga characters, definitely I mention Mada. She's one of my favorite antagonists.
Okay.
And
Oh, go
No,
ahead, Anita.
go for it.
everyone, to know my first favorite, please read Long Scott.
We're gonna read it. Don't worry,
We will.
Yes.
We will.
Yeah, that's on the TBR.
I'll
Yeah,
read
pillar.
one.
Thank you, Charmin.
Okay.
I'm actually quite similar to Alan's comment, where I love villains, but I haven't come across many female villains that I really enjoyed. I've come across unlikable female characters, and I've really enjoyed them because they're in that gray zone where they're both captivating and infuriating because they don't make the choices we would hope them to make. They're not exactly the nicest people, but neither are they outright villains. They just have a complete different standard of choices and logic that really fascinates me. One of them is Masako from The Blood of Outcasts by D.A. Smith. And I was very frustrated with this character initially because they're unlikable. You're not meant to like this character. But once you settle into their voice and get in their mind, it's really intriguing and becomes unpredictable in a way. And I really appreciate just finding that balance. Authors being able to find the balance between villain and hero and a point where the character is just who they are and they might be a bit of both, but they're not going to be liked by everyone. And unfortunately, those often are the books that get DNF'd because readers are like, you know what? I cannot stand them anymore for their choices and their actions. But the more I read of this character, the more fascinated I am. But I would love to, like Anitha, I'm going to read that because I need more villains, female villains that I love.
Well, I know for me,
Varsha.
A Song of Ice and Fire, Cersei Lannister was one of my favorite characters to read from throughout the series. And I'm going to be rereading more of the book soon, but man, I couldn't get enough of her, even though I think she would be considered a villain. I don't know. Is she considered a villain or just unlikable? I don't know where that line crosses, but anyway, and Umbridge from Harry Potter, I think is probably one of the best female villains I've ever read.
She elicits some very strong emotions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My friend
But
Andy
I
Smith did a fantastic
but
video.
I don't like Amrit. Sorry, John, for interrupting. Go ahead.
Oh, but she's an amazing villain. She's amazing. Like she's unlikable, but in the best way possible.
Okay.
Andy Smith did a fantastic video about why Umbridge is more unlikable than Voldemort. And
Yeah.
he made a really good point, which is that Umbridge is a character that you're around all the time. The characters are in the school with her, whereas Voldemort is this kind of ethereal, out there kind of dark power that we don't see, maybe more insidious in some ways. And Umbridge is just vile. And I loved how vile she was. I'm not saying I like Umbridge in the sense that uh well, I love Cersei. Okay, I just loved reading her perspective. So, so yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I want to say that, but also I have been reading a lot of darker fantasy lately, and I think even in Malazan you see this a little bit here and there, but you actually see some female predators. Some female predators, like in Baker, you have some characters of like female, like sexual predators. And that I was kind of surprised to read about, and that's not comfortable to read about at all. But I appreciated, even though it's ugly and gross, in any case, even if it was a male predator, whatever, I think it was interesting to see that perspective, because I don't feel like we get that perspective a lot in fantasy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this one I'm intrigued by. I'm here for this. I'm so here for this. Whatever book this is, I want to read it. Let's see, there was one. Oh, Queen Bev Morta from Willow. I'm not sure what series this is from.
Live
Andrew.
ships.
Live ships. Ah, yes, that's another one I've been told I'm going to enjoy. Let's see. My husband in the other room, Lady Macbeth, actually is one that I would pull from as one of my like she's my dream theater role, to be honest. Like I would love to play her someday, because there's and that again, back to our conversation about nuance and like depth of character, there's so much there. There's just so much there, and every time you think you have her figured out, there's another layer that opens up.
That's a good example.
Yeah.
I played the Wicked Queen in Snow White in high school, by the way.
Nice.
That was pretty scary.
Narnia has the female villain, but I think she doesn't have much agency. I mean, that's how I felt. I did not care about her.
Mm-hmm. Varsha?
Oh, I was going to say Andrew's Wizardly Reads mentioned Lucky Mies from the Bone Ships. Her mother, I think, is an excellent villain.
I can't wait. I need to read that trilogy.
I love that trilogy. It is very good.
Nice.
Someone mentioned grandma female villains. I cannot think. I read something about some old woman. Now I cannot recollect. Now I have to find that person.
Let's see. Yeah, a lot of umbrage in the comments. I can't even say that word. Thursday Next series by Jasper Ford, Aornis Hades. She's a something morph, pure evil. Is that a thriller or a fantasy, or what genre is that, Trisha? Sorry, what you're going to say, Johanna?
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just had another idea come to my head.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say, there's a type of trope. It happens in Game of Thrones, and it happens actually in A Touch of Light, that I've decided I really love. And it's not necessarily if it's a male or female. I've seen it both. It happens in different genders in those two series. But I love it when you have an older character that seems like a wise old character that the younger character trusts, and then they turn out to be totally twisted, and it's like you bargained with the devil kind of thing. I've decided, I don't know. I think it's a trope. I've decided it's a kind of trope, and I love it. I live for it.
I have a book recommendation for you later, Johanna. Remind me.
Okay, cool.
I don't want to spoil anything.
Fantastic.
100,000 Kingdoms by N.K. Jemisin has one female villain. Now I cannot recollect her name. Charmaine, you can help me here. She's actually not the best kind of female villain, but decent enough. Actually, I like that villain character.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times authors pull away from female villains too much, and that's another area where I'm like, if you're gonna dip your toe in, go for it. Like, give us something really memorable and something really interesting, and just like, I think people kind of tiptoe around female villains too much sometimes. That might just be my perspective, but it seems like sometimes people are a little hesitant to really jump full on into female villains.
That's a good point.
This one is one that really gets me. Mother Gothel Entangled.
Yeah.
Cleopatra from Augustus. Her letters are like one of the best. Oh my god, I loved her letters in Augustus.
I'm just about to start that next week with my dad as a buddy read.
What was the character?
Cleopatra.
Oh, yeah. I didn't think of her as a villain. I could see how she's definitely gray. Yeah. I wouldn't think of her as a villain per se, but yeah, it's a great book.
What do you all think about? Sorry, go ahead, Anita.
Okay, just one last point. Not exactly villains, but how they change the story, how they affect the character's fate. I don't want to mention book names, but read KJ Parker. Go ahead, Varsha. I'm done.
Oh, I was gonna ask what you all think about the fairy tale retellings from the female villain perspectives. That maybe sometimes helps us understand why they turned all villainy, or sometimes just oh they weren't a villain after all. Yeah, I'm curious what you all think.
I think it depends on. Sorry for jumping ahead. It
You're
depends
fine.
on how they are executed. I think Cersei was done very, very well. That's the only thing I can think of right now.
Yeah, I liked Cersei. I guess it
Um,
depends. I need examples. I don't know if I've read a
Like,
lot of.
well, I'm assuming you're thinking of the live adaptations of things like maybe Maleficent and that kind of stuff, Varsha.
Oh,
yeah,
Um,
yeah. Or I
yeah.
think there's a book about. I haven't read it yet, but I think there's a book from Gothel's perspective. Since someone
Oh,
mentioned,
really?
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read any from like retellings with the female villain's perspective. Most of the retellings that I end up reading, the women are, cast to kind of the side, and the male characters kind of shine, or um, the female characters are just portrayed as strong female characters, not necessarily villains. So I know the Gothel retelling is one I think I have on my shelf to read.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen Cruella yet, but I want to. I think this gets into, I think, a little bit of what people like in their characters, because I know so many readers who really like the white and black, like if your villain is a villain, let them be a villain, you know. And I'm one of the people that likes lots of shades of gray in my characters, and so to me, even if it's a character that I don't like and they're just a horrible character and they're doing horrible things, it's not that you condone the behavior that they're showing, but there's a way to kind of backtrack and look at how did we get here? Where did that come from, and how is this person making okay with making the choices that they're making, and like what led to that? So I really love that, and I actually really liked the Maleficent movie when it came out, because I thought it was just, I mean, she's such a cool character anyway, and then kind of diving in deeper to her a little bit was really cool. So yeah, I like it.
Actually, that's a good point, Tori. Everything depends on how they're executed, what kind of background we have, what kind of circumstances force these characters to make certain choices. Every trope, actually, that point is valid. Any trope can be executed well if we get that kind of information. Good
Yeah.
example for this I can think of is, suppose this trope of young female characters ending up with older men.
Mm-hmm.
I generally don't like that, especially when there is a pattern. More if it happens like more than a couple of times. But irrespective of that trope being there in Shadows of the App series, I really like that series because of, I could understand why this person made that kind of choice. What drove them to that decision. We had that information right there. I think that's why I could digest it.
Yeah. I think it also gives us a chance as readers to engage with the story a little bit more, because it shows you, here's the path we took to get here. Do you think it's warranted or not? And that's kind of the unspoken question that we get in a lot of these kind of stories, where we're given that backstory of this, all the shades of gray that exist in a villain. Are they a villain? Do you understand what they're doing? Does it make sense? And would you have done the same thing, or do you disagree with it? And I think it engages our us as readers a little bit when we're given more of that information in the story.
hmm.
Yeah, Wicked was one that Patricia brought up, and I immediately remembered a lot of the, Yeah, that's another really good good one for this, Patricia. Elphaba is a great character. So yeah, well, I think that was all of the questions that I had on my list. So I kind of want to give you guys a chance to add any last thoughts to the discussion of things that you thought of while we were talking, or last comments that you'd like to make before I close things out. Kay, do you want to start?
Honestly, I think we covered pretty much all of it, like anything that I could think of or have comments on. I love hearing everyone's perspectives on it because we all have different experiences with it. We've all had different experiences in our own lives that lead us to pick up different books and connect with different characters, which I think is one of the more important takes out of reading. You know, every reader, male, female, doesn't matter, you're going to take something different away from the books, and you're going to take something completely different from the characters. And really, it's, how did you feel about their arc? How did you feel about their representation? How did you feel about how the authors took their story? And so long as you find characters you love, or the love to hate characters, even with strong female characters is another one where, yeah, they're the villain, or yeah, they are terrible people and maybe unredeemable, but you'll love to hate them because they are written so well. So I don't know, I think we kind of covered it all.
Johanna?
Yeah, that was just so beautifully said. I just would echo everything that Kayla said because that was so beautifully said. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are different kinds of stories, and even if we're reading classic fantasy, this is something I thought about more recently, I guess, and I have to thank Philip Chase a bit for helping me to understand this, but there is a place at times for flat characters. Like, they do serve a purpose at times in a narrative. But yeah, I think that it is nice that we are getting so many more character-driven stories these days, and I also just appreciate, especially in fantasy, whenever we see a female character well represented, because I just don't think it's been the norm for so long. And so, I don't know, these are all really interesting conversations to have, and I don't really land on one specific exact way that I think a character needs to be, but I always appreciate when a character gets me to engage with them, like Kayla was saying, and make me wonder about them. And I think that's why we read, right? So thank you for having me. This was fun.
Yes.
Varsha?
I must unmute first. Yeah, I think I agree with everything Kayla and Johanna said. I love that we have a wide spectrum of characters to read from, and we can pick and choose what we like and what we don't like. I think what I appreciate most of all in what authors do with female characters especially, but maybe about other real life things as well, is if you leave the real world at home. Like, you don't have to always comment on, hey, that's a woman in power, like what I appreciate about Malazan so much, right? If we get more of that, I believe that books and art and stories can change people. So if we get more stories like that, I think that would be wonderful. But meanwhile, we have everything in between to choose from.
ANITHA?
I mean, all three of them wrapped it up very well. I don't have anything left to say. So, thank you all for having me, and read Long Price Quartet.
I was just going to say that. Yeah, thank you guys so much for sharing your time to be on the channel and to be part of Imposter Syndrome. I'm so glad that we've been able to talk about this topic, because I knew that it was one that was really important for me to make sure that I was able to talk about on the channel, and I appreciate all of you guys' perspectives and the time that you spent to be here. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you for
so much
having
for
us.
having us.
Thank you guys so much for also being in the chat once again. If you are not subscribed to any of these beautiful ladies, please go down in that description box below and sub to all of their channels. They all put out amazing content, and you should go watch it. So thank you guys for joining us, and we will see you in the next video.